Before I toddled off to school in the early 1940s, this is what the landscape towards Fleetwood was like. In my elementary school years, which were over at the end of the decade, 12th Street would come to life. Many of those who moved into the area had young families, and the kids were my friends. Many of us played together, and I have often wondered what their lives were like as time moved on. 12th Street South from 8th to 9th was our street. Here are some things I remember. Hopefully someone has taken the time to record what life produced on your street. In the 1940s, I was pretty well a neighborhood, free-range kid. At least once I started school. Mum had a little police whistle, as we called it, and when she wanted us home for lunch or whatever, she would blast away in code so we knew generally who or what she wanted. There was a good number of kids down the newly built block, and we played together, mostly. I'll take a little time to tell you about them. On the corner of 9th Avenue and 12th Street lived the Nixons. Mr. Nixon, along with Mr. Swan, ran Perlux Cleaners. The older boy, Jerry, was in my class at school. He used to bring a variety of items to school that had been found in clothes being cleaned. Jealous, no doubt, I particularly remember a fine-looking jackknife. The family had a beautiful German shepherd dog that had probably been trained for police or related work. It was very friendly, unless you pointed at it. Hey, it's not a gun, it's a finger. They bought a new car after the war, as many people did. In their case, it was a beautiful Packard. Before the family moved to Victoria in the mid-1940s, where they operated the Fox Theatre, Jerry taught me an important lesson. While returning from a Saturday morning matinee at the Capitol Theatre, I decided while passing through Central School grounds to start a fight with Jerry for a reason long forgotten. I got whomped. Deciding picking fights was not my forte, I never did it again. Professionally, Jerry became a bus driver, possibly Greyhound. He would visit us from time to time, but sadly died many years ago. The younger brother, Gary, was an interesting character. Until he went to school, he had difficulty talking. Whatever the problem was, he sure got over it. When he visited Joan and I at university in the early 60s, he was promoting foreign film festivals across Canadian university campuses. Later, as disenchantment with social institutions spread with the 1960s counterculture, and alternative schools sprouted up outside the local public school system, Gary started his own school. Calling it the Ideal School, he published a job posting in the Vancouver Sun, promising prospective teachers freedom, fascination, and abject poverty. 6 teachers comprised the original staff, chosen from a pool of over 60 applicants willing to work for much lower salaries than could be made in the public school system. Ideal School was originally housed in the Vancouver Fancy Sausage Factory. The blood gutters had to be cleaned out before the staff and students could move in. Faced with financial difficulties, the school eventually became part of the Vancouver public system and still operates today. But Gary moved on. He arrived on our doorstep again in the early 1980s. He had been teaching Irish history in Ireland and had started an accounting firm with offices in Vancouver and Ireland. He offered to go back years and redo our taxes, saying he was sure he could get us a lot of money back. He did. We visited his beautiful home and office in the heart of Vancouver in 2007. Sadly, he died in Ireland in 2014. Across the street at 836 12th Street lived the Dobbs. Mr. Dobbs, a World War I veteran, was a steam engineer working for the Canadian Pacific Railway. One day he invited me to join their son Ken for a short ride in a steam engine. It was short but very memorable, as it took considerable time to work up the steam. Mr. Dobbs, during the war, had been part of a machine gun squad made up entirely of Lethbridge residents. He was wounded in 1916, and after coming home to recuperate, he went off to fight again. The Dobbs home was one of only 2 pre-World War I homes on the block, and it was demolished and replaced in 2020. The other, the home on the corner, belonged to Alex Wood, a long-time resident who developed all the films dropped off at stores throughout the city. Along with the new cars everyone seemed to be getting after the war, ended in 1945, the Dobbs had a Chev, new balloon-tired bikes hit the market. Like the cars of the era, with lots of chrome and frills, the bikes looked cool, but with only 1 speed, and big tires, they proved to be quite the workout. Ken and I made many a trip to the isolation hospital to drop off baking goods by the front door for his aunt, Miss Mildred Dobbs, who cared for patients with diphtheria, polio, even smallpox for 39 years. Ken played the clarinet, and he was probably the one that got me interested in joining the band. After high school, he took a petroleum engineering course at Mount Royal and worked as a draftsman in Calgary until 1983. After he retired, one day he and his wife Eve passed through town in a new motorhome on their way to the Maritimes. He was on oxygen at the time. The last time I saw him was when I was receiving a Heritage Service Award at Calgary's Palliser Hotel in 1985. He died in 1997 at age 64. A few houses north of the Dobbs, Clarence and Hazel Hanson built their home at 822. Except for the Dobbs house and the one south of it, all the homes in the area were built when I was a kid. We all had great fun digging caves on the open prairie where we would roast potatoes and try to snare gophers. Sometimes, because the area was at the edge of what in times past was called Duff Lake, we occasionally found salamanders. Once homes started to be built, there was an ample wood supply, which we would often, borrow to build forts. Don's dad was a traveler for Scott Fruit Company. He would travel around taking orders for their products, one of which was Eat More chocolate bars. Maybe no one wanted them, which is something I can understand. Whatever the case, after school we would often go over to his house and indulge. Don was in my class and a very good student, better than me, I recall, but he quit school in grade 10 and went to work at Scott Fruit. I remember Mr. Rudd, the World War I vet who had a facial wound and affected his speech, having a serious altercation with Don the first day in class. Maybe that had something to do with his quitting. Don was an easygoing kid and not one you would expect to be causing trouble. A few years earlier, I remember meeting Don on his arrival a little late at the showing of the Saturday morning matinee at the Capitol Theatre. He told me he had just found out that he had diabetes, something I knew nothing about, but it sounded serious. He went on to play tuba in the band, and I have always wondered if it further caused his later problems. In his early 30s, he was blind and taking courses at the university, recording them on a tape for study. He died at the age 35 in 1971. His younger brother, who I am told became a professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, died a few years after Don. Across the street at 821 lived friends Steve and John Tolstrup. Steve and John were athletic. I remember the year 1948. The Cleveland Indians were fighting to win the World Series. The Tolstrups were so into sports, I decided it must be the cool thing. I bought a couple of Sports Illustrated magazines so that I, too, could rattle off statistics.
To take the series 4-2.
I just could never get into it. But I still have the covers from the magazines I bought, so maybe that counts for something. That was the summer I learned about weeping tile. The Tallstrips, I expect others on the block also, were digging around the foundations of their homes as they discovered their new homes had been built on a dried-up drainage route to the river. From the kid perspective, it was great. We had our own hockey rink in the alley. I don't know that it qualifies as a sport, but I won a pool championship trophy. Yes, we spent a lot of time goofing around in the game room. Then one summer, we camped out in the backyard. After the war, while the parents were using up their savings buying cars, the kids were getting bicycles. Balloon-tired bikes were all the rage. Ken had his roll-fast. Mine was a Schwinn, which Dad picked up in the States. They were the ones that advertised in the comics. I remember I was so intrigued by the fact that the Goodyear tires on my bike had the same tread as car tires. Steve got a Schwinn too. Just a little fancier than mine, of course. Mr. Tallstrip's new car was a Hudson, which caused him considerable grief. As I recall, he was observing the engine when there was a fire. Our family usually rented a cottage for a month in Waterton. Although I don't remember the event, on this occasion, Brian, Bruce, Steve, and John were captured by someone with a better camera than we had at the time. John, a popular kid, was school president in both junior and senior high. He became a successful trial lawyer, and by the time he came to our high school reunion in 1985, he was very high up in the LDS Church in Vancouver. Unfortunately, his winning days ended soon. I believe a daughter was killed in a tragic car accident, and in 1995, at the age of 58, he found out he had prostate cancer. The doctor said he might not want to do anything about it. But always the fighter, John dug in with exercise and drugs. He also went public in hopes of warning others to be tested, as the accompanying article relates. But does cancer really go away? Or does it just hide and regroup? He was 61 when he died. Steve, who was a year or so older than me, eventually took over the family business, which his father had started in the 1940s. Like many family businesses that started around that time, it flourished. I saw Steve a few times over the years, and the last time he didn't seem to recognize me. I have heard since that he battled Alzheimer's disease. I also spent a lot of time in the 1940s with Terry Defoe, who lived at 1234 7th Avenue. His father was manager of the Lethbridge Sash and Door Company, and one time drove us to see the construction of the St. Mary's Dam. But Terry and I also did a lot of traveling on our own. A major jaunt was to Old St. Mary's picnic site, which was a popular spot years ago before it was gated. A bunch of us made a number of trips to the airport to visit the old bombers stored there after the war. And then, of course, there were many train trips with the band to Calgary Stampede and at least one to the Crow's Nest Pass. At a special ceremony at the border in 1949, I remember watching a jet break the sound barrier. Terry, a fireman who rose up the ranks in Edmonton, stopped by and we had a visit in 2013. Although his wife Joan, a daughter of Lethbridge's former police chief Jim Carpenter, died in 2017, Terry, it appears, is still with us. A classmate, Don Nielsen, lived at 815 12th Street. The family moved to Calgary in the early elementary years. Other young people who lived down the block in the 1940s were as follows. The Kirks, Iris and Patty at 811. Nathan Kirk, the father, was a partner in establishing Kirk's Tires. Across the street, Harold, Doug, and Mary Pat Fleming lived at 804. Their father ran Fleming Motors at the time. Lorraine Price, who was also a classmate at school, lived at 817. Her father ran Purity Bottling, the distributor of Coca-Cola. Across the street at 824, the Earls built a house. Doug Earl was in my class at least for a while, but they were only in the area for a short time. Ken Thomas lived at 830. Ken played a tuba in the band. After high school, I believe he went into the Peace River country, farming. It was a new frontier. Finally, for a short time there lived at 825, probably the kid on the block who became most famous, Brian Blackburn, who died in 2012. He was a medical graduate from the U of A and spent his career in the United States, primarily as a forensic pathologist. He became internationally known when in 1997 he did the 32 autopsies of the Heaven's Gate members who committed suicide following the Hale-Bopp comet. Unfamiliar with his bizarre story? Google it. Now you've met the kids down the block in the 1940s, as I remember them.